Hey everyone, on this week's episode of NYC Round, I have a New York legend, Ben Sun. He's the co-founder and managing partner of Primary Ventures, a world-class VC firm that invests in early-stage startups and was born here in New York. Ben's also been recognized on the Forbes Midas list as one of the top 100 tech investors in the world. On this episode, we dive into the history of New York City's tech ecosystem, his major tells that an early-stage startup is likely to make it to the Series A round, and how his experiences as a founder impacts how he interacts with and supports founders today. Ben Sun, a New York legend. I'm so excited for this episode. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you co-founded Primary Ventures, a firm that invested heavily in the New York City ecosystem before many were. I want to dive deeper into that and your telling of the history of New York City. But first, I'm really interested in Primary and how you guys identify the founders that you're going to invest in. And one thing I noticed is that you try to identify founders who, you tell your investment team to wait for great. What does that mean?
When we talk about wait for great, it's hard to really know, right? We actually do these offsites where we're doing one upcoming for the investment team, and the whole theme is like identifying greatness. Mm-hmm. And we're having investors and different founders come in that we think represent that or have worked with great, just to even share their perspective. So even our own definition, I think, is very personal or subjective and fluid. What I anchor on is a lot of it is like, first and foremost, it's like the founder. There are just certain people that we kind of talk about that you would never bet against, in anything. Like if they decided to take up French cooking, you'd be like, they're going to be really good at it.
Yeah, you would not want to be on the other side of that equation.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
There's just certain people that and what are then the common traits that allow them to do that? I mean, it varies, right? I mean, there's definitely some their learning machines, mm-hmm. their perseverance and their obsession of stuff is a big factor. I don't know, the ability to sell and recruit and get other really talented people involved in and helping them and coaching them or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's also a skill set. It's just a combination of all these different things. And some people just index maybe one of those traits more than another, but when you add them all together, you're like, yeah, I wouldn't bet against that person.
Right.
So when we start with the notion of wait for great, at least on an investment opportunity, is founder being great.
Right. And
would you bet against that person? Then we look at things like the market, the solution that they're building. Do we feel like that's also great? Markets of not only just being potentially big, but I especially think having real tailwinds. Mm-hmm. If you bet on a market which may be big, but over time it's going to face kind of headwinds because technology transformation or whatever the headwinds may be, that's just a dangerous place to be. Because when you think about investing, especially as a seed stage investor, your exit is going to come maybe 10 years from now.
Yeah.
And 10 years from now, that company's going to get valued on what happens the next 10 to 20 years.
Right.
So if you're facing kind of small headwinds now, by 10 years from now, those small headwinds might look like big headwinds.
I think it also speaks, though, to the fact that you're investing in the person, more than the idea almost, because 5 years from now, that company may look completely different. But what's common is that founder that you have in front of you.
Very much so. But, their starting point of, we've met with great folks that were just wow, that's going to be a hard market.
Yeah.
And I look back at my experience. I mean, I was a founder for 12 years.
Yeah.
And it was a hard business. I tell people, I felt like I was a pretty good founder operator, but it was squeezing water out of a rock.
Yeah.
And then I've seen really great founders play in amazing markets with real product market fit. And then I'm like, wow, that's like squeezing water out of a giant wet sponge.
Yeah.
And so I told
But are those more competitive though? Because theoretically they're less difficult than the squeezing water out of a rock.
They may be, but I'd rather be, facing great markets with great tailwinds, with great business models that you find great product market fit with some competition than oh wow, there's just this undercurrent that's always dragging you down.
It makes sense.
And so when I think about that, there's yes, there's this like, first and foremost, if you don't have a great founder, you're kind of dead in the water. But man, what an advantage if you have the right market and find product market fit. I mean, and find things that provide you real tailwinds. Giant wet sponges are a lot of fun.
I feel like that's the headline for this episode. So you said something in there really interesting. What did your experience as a founder teach you as an investor?
Startups are incredibly hard.
Yeah.
We have this kind of motto, or kind of the kind of notion of a core purpose of why we exist, is this notion of startups are hard and founders deserve better. And that was kind of based on my experience. Like I had, bootstrapped my company out of my apartment for the first 2 years. I then raised about $20 million of both angel money and then venture money, and went on this like 12-year journey. And at the end of it, I looked back at my experience and was like, my investors beyond the capital, were they really that helpful? And I was like, not really.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'd probably would say beyond the capital, they were probably more negative value.
Interesting.
And a lot of that was just because if they weren't that hands-on and got deep into the business, I don't think they fundamentally understood it. And because they didn't fundamentally understand it, I always felt like we were misaligned. So it's like being in a 12-year marriage where you're just like, oh, this person's not getting me, this person's not getting me. And it just becomes,
that makes sense.
It becomes more of a friction point than like an accelerator. And so I always felt like that was the kind of underlying theme on the founder startup journey, as you kind of pointed out, where the market goes, where the business goes, it's going to have all these different ups and downs and twists and turns. And those challenges are really, really hard. And if you can somehow provide kind of real support to help them navigate that, I think you can actually really make a difference in the founder journey.
Got it. Can you speak briefly about like Primary's unique value proposition? Like one thing I've read a lot about is just how involved your platform team is, but like speak to an audience of like early stage founders who are going through the fundraising process for the first time ever, and they have their list. Why should Primary be on it?
Yeah, so I'd say first and foremost, when we look at our team, the composition of our firm, and we have about 50 full-time people there, but only about a third of the team are investors.
Yeah.
And really the remainder of the team, so almost 2/3 of the organization, are operators that full-time, that sole purpose is to help our companies after we invest. And so let me talk about those two different roles. The investor role, I think first and foremost, they need to be strategic thought partner, right? And what I mean by that is, Justin's a founder, you're building a fintech company. If I had to market map maybe 10 years ago what the fintech market landscape looked like, you can fit in like a quarter of a one-page slide.
You don't need much paper.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you need a 100-page deck, and it would be like microscopic of all the list of names. And what you see is, hey, the competitive landscape and the choices that consumers or businesses have, I mean, it's become a lot more competitive. And people are getting each other's businesses, how you partner with guys, how you position yourselves. It's now playing like this chessboard of like, hey, what are the moves we need to make in order to stay ahead?
Right.
And if you're on that journey as a founder, you want someone that's a thought partner who sees that stuff, who knows the players, who gets the insights, who's helping you be a thought partner to figure out how to play the chessboard, how to be a couple moves ahead of everybody else. But that's one part of the founder journey. The other parts of the founder journey are your day-to-day things like, how do I get in front of customers? How do I recruit and retain great talent? How do I think about raising my next round? Right. What are the things I should be focused on operationally over the next 6 to 12 months? Those are things that we said, hey, we can help provide that at the earliest stages. We saw our other peers like Andreessen starting to do this as large multi-stage funds. Yeah. But those resources were primarily used for companies that they invested $100 million in.
Right.
When they do a seed round, it's not a resource that they're really giving up, right? If you're managing $8 billion and you write a $2 million check, you're not telling your talent team, go help that $2 million check.
It adds like social proof.
Yeah, they're going to wait and they're going to say, hey, I'm going to throw in a check, and if it becomes big, then I'll get my operating team to help out. But think about that journey as a founder, those early days, that's more mission critical than ever because you're under resourced. You just raise a seed round, you're going from 4 people to 15 people. Every single hire is critical.
Yeah.
And you have no head of people, no dedicated recruiting team. You have no brand.
Yeah.
So you start calling people and say, hey, I'm Justin. Hey, Miss Software Engineer, come work for me. They're like, who the hell are you?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And then you're also for the first time saying, wow, I've actually never scaled a engineering team and know how to recruit that. And how do I think about, comp and structure and all that stuff and the interview process? Well, if we can help you navigate that, give you those resources, that's a huge leg up.
Right.
And so when our founders then meet our operating team, when we go and give a term sheet, we start pitching them why they should partner with us. And our teams go through and deep dive into their business and they tell them what they can do. Like, these are the things that we're going to really provide for you.
I just don't understand why you wouldn't take that option. Like, if you're a maybe it's something I'm not understanding, but if you're a founder, you want to increase the number of your at-bats, increase your surface area for success, and that includes resourcing.
Yeah.
Why would you just want the funds by itself?
I mean, that's exactly why we went this route.
Yeah.
We knew that the market was becoming more commoditized for just basically on capital.
Right.
And if you can actually truly have an impact, then you can be really differentiated. The problem why the industry hadn't done it is because it's expensive.
Yeah.
So, the secret in venture is that venture has now become big enough where running a venture firm, the fees that you collect is actually a very profitable business. And so even for a firm that we run ourselves, we now manage $1 billion. Our LPs, to be candid with you, if we cut half the team, probably wouldn't blink an eye.
Right.
Because they rarely see a seed firm with 50 full-time people anyway. Even 25 people, it's rare. Mm-hmm. So they'd be like, oh, 25, that's still a lot. And so what would you do with all those fees if you didn't pay for those extra 25 people?
Right.
Me as the partner, I'd say, well, I get to put it in my own pocket.
That's right.
And so when I say it's expensive, it's personally expensive to the people running and managing those firms.
Right.
And why we decided to do it was we wanted to be completely aligned with our LPs and our founders. We wanted to not make money off of fees, but make money off of the success of the portfolio and our carry.
Got it.
And we realized if we can invest in team and resources and then work with the best founders, then we'll have a better portfolio and we're much more aligned with our founders and our LPs. And at the same time, it gets back to our core purpose as a firm, which was, hey, startups are hard, founders deserve better. And if we're willing to take those fees and plow it into team resources to make that experience hopefully better and give those founders a better chance of success, then we knew over the long term that's going to be the winning formula.
That makes sense. And then continuing to dive deep into how Primary thinks about founders, your early stage fund, one of the examples you give is what is the likelihood that this founder will make it to Series A? What tells you that? Hey, before we get to their answer, I wanted to take a quick second to just thank everybody that's been a part of the NYC round journey so far. If you've enjoyed these conversations we've been having with investors and founders, subscribe, and comment down below. Now back to the conversation.
Yeah, I think, if you looked at our performance or my performance personally and our firm's performance, we've done really well. Yeah. I tell folks that, I've done 40 deals in my 14-year career. I'm not doling little checks around. I'm doing 2 or 3 things a year. And out of those 40 deals, had 8 unicorns. And then, one being Coupon, which is, publicly traded for $1 billion. So it's almost like 40 unicorns. Now, if I rewind the clock and say, wow, those 40 deals, I was able to really predict if that company's going to be a unicorn 10 years later, I'd be completely lying to you.
Yeah.
I mean, trying to predict anything out 10 years from now, especially something in tech, is almost impossible. I think what I was really good at was underwriting to its Series A and knowing that it's hard to get to ever be a unicorn if you don't get to a Series A.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And so we kind of just really anchor on this notion of all right, let's really kind of underwrite its opportunity, its ability to get to a Series A.
Yeah.
And the Series A is like, hey, we know what Series A investors are looking for. Are they interested in that category? What are the metrics they're looking for? What do they want to see? What do they need to prove? And that 18 to 24 months of that seed round capital that gives you, you can kind of start underwriting that. Hey, how many customers they need to get? How much revenue they need to get? Where does their product need to be? What do they got to prove out in the market? What does the team got to look like? And then you start underwriting the team's ability to execute against that plan. And if you can then also help them get to that plan, then you can suddenly have a really high, what we call C to A graduation rate. The C to A graduation rate for the industry historically has only been like 25, 30%.
Yeah.
We've been historically over 90%.
Wow.
And that's what almost leads to this higher kind of unicorn hit rate, is because you get people past that first step of finding product market fit and get to a Series A.
I thought you were going to say play more pickup basketball and see what their jump shot looks like.
Not quite.
Yeah. Because I mean, that's one of the ways you met one of the founders, right?
I did. I mean, I like telling that story because I think people find it like incredibly serendipitous. But at the same time, like the founder of Coupon Bomb, I mean, we knew each other from playing pickup basketball at weekends at Stuyvesant High School. We didn't know each other. We just started like showing up at the same time, and then his friends would play my group of friends. And then Bomb just found out from one of his friends, because he was thinking about doing a tech startup. He had been an entrepreneur. He had done a print media business that he sold. And as he was thinking about different startup ideas, he was like, I'm not going to do another print media business.
Yeah.
Again, that's squeezing water out of a rock.
Out of a rock.
And he said, well, let me look at tech. And his friends were like, oh, you should talk to Ben. We play basketball with him. He's been a founder. He's now investing. And that's really how we got connected.
That's awesome.
And so I like to say, like, yeah, it was serendipitous, but it was also, basically, 12, 14 years of me being a founder, then started investing.
Yeah.
That really was the catalyst of him saying, hey, you want to grab lunch?
Right.
And so, that kind of history of hard work and getting you there helps enable those opportunities.
That makes sense. So we've talked about the qualities that make founders great, the ones you don't want to bet against. We've then talked about the qualities that you think make for founders that you think will make it to Series A, given your high percentage success rate there. Yeah. The 20% that have made it to unicorn status, what made them stand out? What separated them?
I mean, some of them were just like, unbelievable. Some of these folks that I've worked with, Bomb at Coupon is certainly one of the highest on the list. Like all these kind of attributes, if you wouldn't bet against the guy. Decent basketball player.
That's what I'm saying.
Incredibly competitive.
Yeah. What does their defense look like?
Yeah, I would definitely back then bet you I could beat him one-on-one. But he would really try damn hard to beat you.
I wonder if he would agree.
Bomb and I joke around today. I remember like my friends, I used to bring my crew of friends and play his crew of friends. And then we were consistently beating them. But we were weekend guys. We were older. We were older than those guys, so we didn't really take it that seriously. And then finally, there was a game where his team of friends, his friends won. Him and his team of friends won. And then Bomb was like on the sideline going like celebrating like yes. And his friends were like so embarrassed because me and my friends were like, oh, we didn't even like realize we even care that we lost. But it just shows you like
that excitement, intensity.
His intensity is like wanting to like win and drive and like, hey, I want to, charge up that hell and figure out how to conquer it. He just has all these attributes. Like you just wouldn't bet against the guy. I usually think about like, oh, if I was running the same business, would I want to compete against you? And I'm a very competitive person, and he's just the guy I would not want to compete against. He's just incredibly driven, incredibly smart. He recruits great people, great first principles thinking, like all of these different things.
Yeah.
You just would not. He'll work you. He'll run circles around you in so many different ways.
That makes sense. I was going to ask you about that, like, the quality of don't bet against. And I've heard you on other podcasts say, like, Elon's an example. He is a great example. There's like a lot of well-documented examples of like why, but like you're meeting a founder for the first time, there's no data points at all.
Yeah.
So, but I feel like I heard the answer there near the end.
Yeah. I think the journey of meeting them and getting to know them, and this was, I think this was also a struggle in venture where people at the height of the market was using almost speed as a weapon to win deals, at least on the VC side. And I thought that got really dangerous because you want to spend time with like the founder. In the beginning, early days, it was months, if not over the course of like a year or so, right? I mean, Bob and I knew each other, probably at least 2 years before we started Coupon. And so I've got to, brainstorm with him on different ideas and get to know him as a person and just see what makes him tick. And even in that course of those 2 years, did I ever think he was going to be the founder that he is now? No, I mean, like he's so exceptional, but there was definitely traits of like, oh, this guy seems pretty special. And so that journey of like getting to know that person, is part of your due diligence process, getting to know them as a human, trying to figure out what really motivates them, not just thinking about their work history, but like their personal history of what like motivates and drives them is something that like, again, when you start meeting people that index on great and you see what great looks like, you're like, oh, that looks like great again.
Probably get better at identifying it too as you go.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. That makes sense. In a previous answer, you mentioned, over a decade doing this, about 40-ish investments. That nets out to each of your partners like 2 to 3 deals a year. How do you manage that stress? Because that feels like a game 7 winning shot every time you do that, given how few reps there are.
The good thing is it ties really well to the wait for great.
Yeah.
Right. If and by the way, the 2 to 3 deals is kind of like the internal target. And I said, look, if you don't get the 2, you only do 1 or none. Like, it's okay.
Gotcha.
Oh yeah. We put like zero pressure on that. In fact, we're just like, look, then we'll just take longer to deploy the fund.
Right.
And we're okay with that.
Yeah.
The first and foremost thing is wait for great. On average, our partners do about 2 to 3 deals a year. To give you a sense though, they look at, on average across the firm, almost about 100 deals that actually seed deals that actually get done in the market. Like someone funded it, even if we passed on it. And that's a metric that we look at pretty closely because, if you just say, hey, someone sent me a deck and that's a potential deal opportunity, I mean, I can tweet today and say, hey, we're actively investing, please send me your deck. And I get 20,000 decks tomorrow. And probably, unfortunately, like 99% of them will never raise around. What you want to look at is how many things you looked at that some other credible investor invested in, and how many of those deals are you seeing in your pipeline. And out of that, you're pulling the trigger on 2 or 3. So to give you a sense, like, our partners are looking at roughly about 100 opportunities that actually someone else invested in, passed on 98 of them, and did 2.
That can sometimes be like a frustration point for founders, though. I've heard from a few where they're like, X fund is investing in us, but their first question was like, who else is investing in you? Like, but I think that's reasonable, right? You have to rely on some data points.
Yeah, this was less of an issue of like, even if a round's not there, if we meet with a founder, we track if they eventually did raise.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a way for us to kind of look at each partner's kind of pipeline and say, hey, how many deals did you look at over the past year that actually got done in the market?
Yeah.
Is your deal flow, and this is the good versus great.
Oh, I see. It helps you sort of track, okay, the ones that we passed on, what were the sort of misses or like got away situations?
That, and also like, if you joined the firm and you said, hey, Ben, I looked at, 100 things this year, and I'm like, how many of those 100 actually raised around?
Yeah.
And you're like, none. I'd be like, okay, your pipeline looks like crap, and maybe you're picking good.
Yeah.
Versus if you told me, oh, I looked at 100 things and there were 100 rounds got done here.
Yeah.
I would say, oh, and you only wanted to do one of them. I'd say, oh, that feels like your pipeline looks like good. Justin's going to pick great.
Yeah.
You're waiting for great.
Right.
And so that's a way for us to like monitor that. So getting back to your original question on like, I'm more concerned about, are you looking at stuff that looks like good quality? Are you picking with then high conviction? And high conviction being like, we don't treat seed investing as an optionality bet. Some of these big firms say, hey, I'm going to write a small check and hang around the hoop, and if it works, that way I can write a big check. That to us is like, you're an optionality bet.
Yeah.
Seed investing is our business.
Right.
If I'm like, hey, Justin, I need all your companies to get through a Series A, like, there's no optionality here. Like, and so you're going to be like, all right, I am going to do 1, 2, maybe 3 deals. I'm going to make sure I have super high conviction. I'm going to get all these operators on our team to help get them there. It starts being our business is seed, is helping you that seed to A journey is the core of our business. And because of that, you wait for great.
Got it. You may not have one, but like, is there an investment that got away in your mind?
I mean, there's tons of investments that got away. I mean, to even give you a sense in New York, over the last 3 years, we looked at all the seed deals that happened in New York City, and we sold for 70% of them. And a lot of those companies became great companies.
Great.
Luckily, we also got a bunch of great companies in the portfolio. So we have, our share of lots of unicorns as well. And you kind of not try to dwell on it too much. I mean, you will have misses in your career.
Mm-hmm.
The more important thing is like, are you still getting your hits?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I can go back and say, oh yeah, I looked at Pinterest's first round at a 3 million pre, and that worked out incredibly well for a lot of others. Shanna Fisher, who's based here in New York, who runs Highline, or the Third Kind now, what she calls it, was that kind of lead early seed investor, and that was an incredible exit for her. But she had Pinterest, and I had my ones. So
that makes sense. Before we transition into like history of New York City tech, one thing I didn't ask is, can you just give a high level sort of story of the beginnings of Primary, like the decision that you made to focus on a specific geographic region? What was the context of the environment at that time? And why was that such a big thing at the time?
Yeah, so, my journey was, I was 12 years as a founder, and I had sold my company in early 2008. And
what was that company for this?
The company was called Community Connect. It was a very early social networking company. Our most popular site was actually an African-American site called Black Planet. So people would meet me and they'd say, oh, you run the biggest black site on the internet. And I said, of course. But it was a good business. We got it to be a good, solid, profitable business. Mm-hmm. I had about 130 employees here in New York around the time when I sold it. And so after I sold it, that's when I started investing and incubating some companies. And I started doing that for the next 4 years. And altogether, my portfolio was basically about 10 companies, all that I kind of did at the pre-seed or seed level, all founders met here in New York. And out of those 10 companies, 4 became unicorns. One of them being Coupon, at $40 billion exit. And I then started getting recruited because I was basically just doing this as a one-man show with no fun.
Right.
It was just my own capital. I started getting recruited by other venture firms. And I remember there was a top 10 Forbes Midas list guy based in the Bay Area that I've been on 2 boards with. I won't name the name, but he was trying to recruit me. And I remember telling him at the time, I'm thinking about starting my own fund, thinking about starting a seed fund focused on New York. And his response was, that's fucking insane. And, if you looked at the data at the time, the biggest exit in New York City tech history up to that point, and this is 2014, was Tumblr. It got acquired by Yahoo for $1 billion. Yeah. So he was like, why would you want to focus on a market where it's produced barely any big outcomes? And my response to him was, I think that's all about the change.
Yeah.
And the thesis was New York was always this great magnet for talent. They just weren't working on startups. The best and the brightest were at, investment banks and PE firms and hedge funds and Bain and McKinsey and even law firms. And that's basically how it was until the financial crisis. And the financial crisis hit, you started seeing this shift in that talent starting to work on startups, right? 200,000 Wall Street jobs were lost. Bain, McKinsey, they fired people, they weren't hiring. Even law firms were firing people. And so if you look at the wave of entrepreneurs that hit post the financial crisis, Mark Laurie used to work in the investment bank in sales and trading. He left, he started diapers.com, sold that for $500 million, jet.com, sold that for over $3 billion. Now he's working on Wonder. He's owner of part owner of the Timberwolves, et cetera. I mean, he's done incredibly well. Dave Gilboa worked at Allen and Co. He then started Warby Parker. Alexa Von Tobel was at Morgan Stanley, and she started LearnVest. Jason Fink was a corporate lawyer. He started Seamless. So you started seeing that shift of talent starting to work on startups. And so here I was meeting these founders, and I'm like, oh, wow, the talent's different.
Yeah.
Traction's different. The people they're able to recruit is different. And you just started seeing the community sort of form where there's like success begets success.
Yeah.
That suddenly if you're coming out of a Harvard MBA and you're thinking about coming to New York, you're not thinking about working at Bain & McKinsey. You're like, maybe I should work for Mark Laurie when he was running diapers.com.
Yeah.
And literally I remember going and meet like Mark and his team, and it was like 8 like Harvard MBAs. They're just like, right. And I'm like, oh wow, this, like, I hadn't seen this in a New York startup before. And this was, back in 2011 or 12. And I'm like, oh, this is different. And then those Harvard MBAs, get their kind of startup chops working at diapers.com, and they go out and start companies, which we saw. And that was a whole notion of success begets success. So the genesis of Primary really came around that's our belief that New York was hitting this major inflection point. But when you looked at venture firms that were based here, focused here, that can lead seed rounds, back then you could count them on one hand.
Yeah. And
so we thought, like, wow, this is an amazing market. So again, talking about picking tailwind markets, we said this is going to be a tailwind market. And to be candid with you, it's probably more of a tailwind market than we've ever imagined. And so that was the genesis of Primary, saying, let's build the best seed fund and let's make New York as our beachhead.
I feel that was in part the answer to my next question, which on a previous, I'll read you the quote, but in a past podcast interview, you've said, quote, a New York guy coming to the West Coast was weird. Can you double click on that and paint the scenario for folks that are building in New York today? What was it like back then?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a founder, I started my company in 1997, a long time ago, and there was nothing here. I mean, if you said, all right, what venture firms are here, what angel investors here, there were basically nothing.
Yeah.
And so you had to go to the Bay Area. And back then, if you're in Sand Hill Road, like, entrepreneurs are coming to Sand Hill Road, they live around the Bay Area, maybe they live in Mountain View or Cupertino, or some entrepreneurs came from San Francisco. Like, that was the culture. And then suddenly, here I am, I get on a plane and I'm trying to get meetings with Sand Hill Road VCs, and they're like, who are you? You came from where? What did you do prior? Oh, I worked at an investment bank. And then they started a tech startup. They're like, yeah, you're not really fitting, the Steve Jobs or whatever the profile of who they backed in the past. So it was incredibly hard. Them just like realizing, hey, do you even have the background and context and experience to be a successful tech founder?
Right.
And then coming and saying, I'm coming from New York and I want to build my company in New York, was even like, that's insane. Like, if you want to really try it, you have to move out to the Bay Area and live out in the Bay Area and then try to raise money from us. And that was a huge challenge.
And then I feel like the earlier sentiment, you had the quote from the other investor of like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, when you started Primary though, like, did you get other pushback or criticism for that decision?
For sure. I mean, it was definitely almost like seeming like a contrarian bet, which is remarkable now if you look at the stats across almost every facet, like number of, companies that went public, to the number of unicorns, to the amount of venture dollars now deployed in New York. New York has now become the second most important tech market in the world, by far. Like, to give you a stat, New York has about 150 private unicorns. If you take the next 10 markets combined, like LA, Boston, et cetera, there's more private unicorns in New York than the next 10 markets combined, right? So people say, oh, what about Miami? Miami has 6 private unicorns. New York has almost 150, right? So it's just a completely different game. So that's where we are now. Back then, that was definitely not apparent. 10 years ago, there were only 3 private unicorns in New York, right? So, and back then, if you had to take 10 years ago when we even started Primary, it's around the time that Snapchat went public, right? So everyone was like, oh, LA is going to be the next big tech hub. Look, Snap is the big exit. And we just had conviction that like, oh no, like the real momentum long-term is going to be New York.
Interesting answer in there too about like, what are the data points you use to predict that? Cause like totally 2015 looking forward, like you're making a bet that most others are not making. You pointed to unicorn founders, I've been looking at so much data that makes me feel really excited about New York. Like last year, New York accounted for 15% of all VC-backed funding compared to 23% in Bay Area for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And then which is like, I don't know if you'd call that a lagging indicator, but then there's in Q1, New York had more seed stage founders than Bay Area.
Yeah.
For the first time ever.
Yeah.
What other data points like excite you about New York today? You made the bet earlier than most did, but
Yeah. So give you some data points here. I mean, if you're an LP investing in venture firms that had to make the bet, you have to make the first case of like, has there now been a history of real exits? And so since 2019, there were over 50 New York City tech IPOs, right? And if you look at a range of companies, right, it's like, Yext, Datadog, MongoDB, DoubleVerify, Peloton, Warby Parker, Sprinklr, Squarespace. I mean, you go on and on and on.
Yeah.
They range from software infrastructure, SaaS, digital healthcare like Oscar, consumer businesses. So all these different wide range of businesses. So real exits, we come a long way since Tumblr being the biggest exit in New York City tech. Now you have, dozens and dozens of companies that went public, and a bunch of these companies now that are valued in the tens of billions of dollars in market cap, like a MongoDB or Datadog.
Right.
Then you talk about the next, who's that next pipeline of IPOs, and when the market opens up, you're going to say, how many private unicorns are there? And again, there are now 150 private unicorns, and that went over the last decade 3 to 150. I mean, so compelling. And then you kind of keep on going down the line, and your best leading indicator is probably the number of founders and seed rounds.
Right.
And that's where now the gap between the Bay Area is so narrow. And where, the last 2 years, we do now New York has about 80% of the seed deals as the Bay Area. So the Bay Area does about 1,200, New York's almost 1,000.
Yeah.
And that keeps on growing at a much faster clip than the Bay Area. Our forecast, if it keeps on going in a trend line, is New York will surpass the Bay Area in seed deals over the next, 5 years.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
I sometimes get from folks, it's like, it's not about New York versus Bay Area. I'm like, it is. I'm a New Yorker. It's competitive, right? But like, what's your answer when folks are like, well, why is New York solidly number 2 and not number 1? Like, to me, it's just time and exits, what you just said. Like, there aren't the OG tech companies like there are in the Bay Area. So it's just a function of time. But is there something like, then you could say that there is, the ecosystem in Bay Area or something. What would you point to as to?
I think you're always constrained on startups is founder talent.
Yeah.
And the greatest thing about New York, the greatest asset in New York was there's always this great magnet for talent. And now that startups are real, it's becoming a different avenue for a career. Mm-hmm. And so even taking a step back, I mean, now there are over 500,000 people that work in New York City tech.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's bigger than a lot of big cities. And so suddenly you're like, wow, those people, and that keeps on growing. And those people that work in New York City tech, they're super ambitious, incredibly talented. They're going to say, hey, I want to be a founder.
Right.
And so you get that pipeline, but then New York's always this great magnet for like young people, right? It's a great city to live as a young person. And startups are pretty much a young person's game.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think just all that success beget success, as well as New York being this amazing city, has been this really kind of formula to make it the catalyst that it needed to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Who would you say is on the Mount Rushmore of NYC tech?
It's a good question.
Besides yourself.
I wouldn't put mine in there, but hopefully one of these days that I have a real impact in the community. There's definitely some obvious legends. We just hosted the first annual New York City Tech Awards, and we did our first Hall of Fame inductee. So I would be kind of foolish not to mention our first Hall of Fame inductee, which I'd consider kind of the status of Mount Rushmore, which is Kevin Ryan. Who's been a great serial entrepreneur and now runs Alley Corp, which both invests and incubates companies. And so Kevin Ryan's legacy is both, having run DoubleClick, but then having starting companies like Business Insider and MongoDB and Guild Group and, a dozen other plus companies. And his legacy is not just on those companies, but really the people that he hired and brought into those companies that now have like gone out and become founders and done amazing work himself. So his fingerprints on the tech ecosystem go well beyond his own companies and more about him creating this incredible breeding ground of these like founders and operators that have now gone to run some of these most successful companies in the ecosystem. So I definitely consider Kevin up there. Fred Wilson, obviously, has been an incredible anchor. And not just for his work as both at Flatiron and USV, but I think what he does for the New York City period of his involvement with, Venture Alliance and New York City Tech and all these other different groups that kind of help advocate for kind of New York to be successful.
Got it. I know you got to run, so 2 more questions for you. You mentioned the financial crisis. Are there other pivotal moments in the history of New York City tech that led it to where it is today?
The financial crisis was a huge catalyst. The rest of it is just this notion of like every both success story and failure story keeps on pushing this momentum forward. And let me give you like Kevin Ryan's journey of even like Gilt Group. Gilt Group was a hot startup. It had an exit that was a much more modest exit. So I think as in an investor lens, it would probably look as like ended up being not a success. But the amount of the Gilt talent that worked there that eventually became founders, I think we tracked that. I think there were like 50 venture-backed startups that came out of like Gilt alum.
Wow.
And some of them like, Zola and et cetera have been like great companies. And that's like to us, like for every not only success, but even like stuff that even failed, I think this really notes the type of people that you have in New York. Ambition and resilience is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
When you have people that are just inherently incredibly ambitious and incredibly resilient, even in the face of some failure, they don't give up and they're like, hey, the next time we do it, we're going to win.
Right.
And I think that's been the underlying part of like what's made New York tech continue to succeed at this accelerator rate is just deep rooted in this like New York culture mentality is like ambition and resilience.
That makes sense. And then my last question is, if I crown you like CEO of New York tech ecosystem and your primary objective, how you're measured for success is helping New York become number 1, not number 2.
Yeah.
What are the 2 to 3 things that you do? What do you focus on?
One of the things that we're actually trying to tackle now, as I think about long term, getting back to your original question of like what's driven its success, underlying talent is such a big deal. The amazing thing about New York, right? If you look at the composition of New York, the majority of New York, the population in New York City, are people of color, and especially Black and brown people. If you walk through the hallways of any of these venture-backed startups, we're probably talking, all honestly, low single-digit percentage at best, underrepresented BIPOC communities that work at these companies. So here you have in New York City this incredible pool of talent that we have not figured out how to unlock. And why does that happen? Because these early stage startups, they're small, they're really fragmented, they don't have big recruiting teams, they don't say, hey, how do we figure out DEI and how to recruit that talent and train them and give them an on-ramp to this? A lot of times we recruit out of our own professional and social circles, right? And inherently it's just going to be folks that have similar backgrounds like you, that look like you, et cetera. And so it's just been a hard industry to bridge kind of that, like, how do you create an on-ramp for this community to kind of know how to work in it, how to start in it, what it's like to work in here, why you should work in here. And in tech has been the biggest driver of global economy, and it will be for the next couple decades at least, right? For sure. And so for us, we said for the future of New York's success, we think a big catalyst of its continuing to succeed is making sure we create that bridge of that incredible talent that's here in New York of having an on-ramp. And so we helped found a nonprofit called Factor, and we're going to run our first fellowship this fall.
Awesome.
And we've gotten the support of dozens of startups now that have joined our program to support it, as well as other VC firms and founders, and Kevin Ryan as an example, who's going to support this initiative. And what we're doing is taking this diverse talent that don't work in venture-backed startups and giving them an on-ramp, training, mentorship, networking, running through a program, connecting them with these companies. And then when they get landed in these companies, give them a pathway to continue to be successful. And until we start changing the composition of those companies from the ground up, like, we're not going to see that kind of ripple effect really kind of happen. And so when even people ask me about, oh, why aren't VCs backing more Black founders? I said, well, you have to understand, like, VCs are looking for certain, like, sector opportunities. For example, like, hey, we want to invest in software infrastructure or AI. It's hard to start an AI or software infrastructure company if you've never worked in software infrastructure.
Makes sense.
That is your breeding ground to become a great founder. And so until we solve the issue of getting more talent to work at venture-backed startups, we're not going to be able to solve the issue of more founders, more executives, more VCs that are in these underrepresented populations to be successful.
Makes sense. Well, thank you for everything that you've done over your career to help the New York City tech ecosystem. We would not be around if it wasn't for the work that you do and many others do.
It's very fun.
Appreciate you stopping by. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Justin.